Welcome back, everyone. This is Dr. Blinch from 2025, and today we're going to discuss stimulus-response compatibility. So this module ties into the last module because we're still talking about the duration of response selection. But last module, it was specifically kind of about the number of stimulus-response alternatives and, Hick-Hyman law. We're going to see that stimulus-response compatibility can also affect the duration of response selection. So this is just to remind us, we've learned about these stages of an information processing. We've got our 3 main stages, or these 5 sub-stages, and we're still talking about the duration of response selection. So to introduce the idea of stimulus-response compatibility, I'd like you to watch this video about a staircase leading to the subway in New York. So give me a pause, check that out, and then come back here. So in that video, what we saw is that there was a step that didn't meet our expectations for step size. So there would be a visual stimulus for the size of the step. And if we came to a step that was, ginormous, we would detect that. We would say, oh, here's a huge step. I'm going to have to step a lot higher. But often we predict or we expect steps to be a size that's familiar to us. So there is code for how large or small steps can be. And from navigating our environment for many years, we've become accustomed to a normal step size. And what must be happening here is that this step is either a little bigger or a little smaller, not so much that we notice it, because if we noticed it, we wouldn't trip on it, but it defies our expectations for a typical step size. You may have encountered this before if you've ever gone to another country. Think a country where people are shorter on average than Americans. So for example, I once went to Japan, and the steps there were all kind of smaller than I expected, and it was awkward at first to navigate them. One thing I should mention about this step is it actually since has been fixed. So if you're visiting New York, sadly, you cannot go visit this awkward step. So just back for a second here. So what we're looking at is this idea between a stimulus and a response and our kind of expectations of how those things should go together. And that's the idea of stimulus-response compatibility. And we'll get to a more formal definition later. But first, some more examples. So this is kind of a humorous example. And, it could cause an injury. Someone might trip, fall awkwardly, and break their arm. But it's mostly just kind of humorous. But stimulus-response compatibility can be of utmost importance for safety and very serious. So what we're looking at here, let me pull up my notes. This is the crash of British Midland Flight 92 back in 1989. And they crashed when attempting emergency landing, tragically close to the runway. And most people on board died, and some were seriously injured. So it was a serious crash. And when there are air crashes, there's typically an investigation of what went wrong and how can we prevent this from happening in the future, and I think that's great. It's unfortunate that we don't treat kind of motor vehicle accidents in the same way, because if we did, of course there'd be more work to do after every accident, but maybe we'd start to realize that, oh, this intersection isn't so safe, it should be redone, or maybe, oh, that was just an unavoidable accident, maybe that was driver neglect, or hey, they were texting, but I think there's a lot of times we could improve our road infrastructure. Okay, well, that's besides the point. So the plane crashed, and they wanted to figure out what happened, and turns out there was an issue with stimulus response compatibility. So let me tell you a little bit what happened. So the plane took off, reached 35,000 feet, its cruising altitude, and the left engine broke. Now the plane had 2 engines, so the protocol is to land at the nearest runway if one engine breaks. So the left engine broke, and it began to vibrate, and smoke was coming out, so it was very obvious there was a problem. Now what the captain and co-captain wanted to do was turn off the left engine and turn around and land at a runway, which they should be able to get to with a single functioning engine. The problem is they turned off the right engine, and by that I mean the incorrect engine on the right. The only working engine, they turned it off. And the reason they didn't notice before it was too late was because when they did that, for whatever reason, the vibration and smoke stopped. So they got this feedback that yes, they had turned off the correct engine, and in this stressful situation, they didn't realize they'd actually turned off their only functioning engine until it was too late. So without both engines, they didn't make it back to the runway. And the question is, how can, the captain, for example, had 13,000 hours of flight experience. That's about 1.5 years in the air. That's a lot of experience. How could they make such, kind of a trivial mistake with such huge consequences? I guess it's not a trivial mistake, it's a catastrophic mistake. And when they looked at the design of the cockpit, they realized it had poor stimulus response compatibility. So here's the cockpit of a 737, and this is the 737-400 version. And there are different versions, and each one would have potentially different cockpit layouts, which makes things very complex for the pilot. So here, the instruments are divided that, these tell you about the left engine, these tell you about the right engine, and same thing over on this side. So the dials that they're looking at were these two top dials. So this should say, hey, there's a problem with the left engine. And if they want to turn off the left engine, they would go down to this lever and they would pull it. Now, I'm not sure if it's this one or this one. There was actually a student in the course once who was a pilot and let me know the terminology, but I've since forgotten it. So they're supposed to detect that, hey, there's a problem with the left engine and we need to pull this lever. But unfortunately, in this stressful situation, and maybe if their lives weren't on the line, if it weren't something they had to do as quickly as possible, maybe they would have made the correct decision. But when they saw a problem with this left engine, they just kind of went to the most closest, easiest response, which was this lever, pulled it, and turned off the right engine. Now, if they hadn't got the feedback that it seemed to be working, then obviously they would have fixed it right away. But by horrible random chance, somehow turning off the right engine made it seem like they had turned off the left engine. Now, this isn't a very efficient cockpit design. The relationship between stimulus and response is complex. And other 737s have better layouts. So in this sort of layout, everything for the left engine is on this side, and everything for the right engine is on this side. So in this case, if they detect something wrong with the left engine or the right engine, you would be pulling the closest lever, which is more intuitive, more reflexive, probably a better compatibility between stimulus and response. Now, there are lots of other examples of stimulus response compatibility that are not so serious. And one of those, when I go to a classroom, I usually have files on a USB drive and I have to plug it in. And I always find this a little bit annoying. It's not life-threatening, but USB drives are unidirectional, right? There's an opening only on one side and it has to go into the opening of the computer. And it's not obvious looking at these which way it goes, and they're small. Sometimes the computer is under the table. So it's really annoying. And I've always wondered, why isn't USB just bi-directional? You can put it in either way and it will work. And with newer versions of USB, so this is the classic USB-A, USB-C seems to be what we're moving towards. These I like because they are bi-directional. If you have a newer cell phone, you don't need to see, does it go this way or that way? No, either way works. It's bi-directional. So it has better stimulus response compatibility. The QWERTY keyboard is kind of a fun, famous example. So it's called QWERTY, I'm not sure if you've heard that term before, because the keys on the keyboard in the top left here, say QWERTY. Would have been more fun if that was the originator's name, but I think it's just how the keys are spelled. So you would think that the QWERTY keyboard is an efficient, has efficient stimulus to response mapping, but the odd thing is it doesn't. So if you look at how the keys are arranged, these percentages show how much of your time you spend typing in the home row. And ideally, you would spend most time typing in the home row because that's where your hands are resting, and the further they have to travel, the slower you're going to be. But it's not the case. Most of the keys you'll be pressing, 52% of the time, you're going to have to move to that upper row. so that's going to slow you down. Also, if you're right-handed, like the majority of the population, QWERTY actually requires you to make slightly more key presses with your left, non-dominant, slower hand than with your right hand. So another inefficient design. So how did we get here? Why do we have an inefficient keyboard layout? Well, there's a few versions of the historical facts here, but I'll go with kind of the most common. And that is that keyboards, well, we're going to have to go back. Before keyboards, there were typewriters, and there were electronic typewriters, and before that, there were mechanical typewriters. That's where things started. And a mechanical typewriter is kind of like a piano. You press a key, and an actual hammer comes up, and instead of hitting a string like in a piano, what it does is it hits an ribbon of ink that against your page leaves that letter on your page. So those are mechanical typewriters. And I'm not sure the exact key layout on the original typewriters, so I should find that out. But they worked well. The problem is people started to use these, every day of their lives, or all work days. Think of a typist, they used it all the time. They got really fast at typing, which is good. The problem was mechanical keyboards couldn't keep up with the speed of typists. So if you press two keys too quickly in succession, they both come up to strike the same area on the page, and they get stuck together. So they're going to hit the ink ribbon, they might mess up what you're trying to write. You got to get your finger in there, pull them apart, you get dirty. You might have to take the page out, start over. It was a mess. So mechanical typewriter creators were trying to figure out how to solve this problem. And I guess they decided, rather than trying to make a more efficient typewriter, they said, well, let's put the keys in a way that are inefficient for these typists. That'll slow them down. And oddly enough, that is how we've come to QWERTY. QWERTY was designed to slow down typists, and it survived to this day. Now, are there more efficient keyboard layouts? Yes. And one famous version is Dvorak. And Dvorak is kind of the opposite of QWERTY in that the keys don't say Dvorak, but Dvorak was the name of the originator. So Dvorak, 70% of the typing is in the home row. Great. And for most people who are right-handed, there's a slight bias to a little more typing, with your right hand compared to your left hand. So Dvorak is way more efficient from QWERTY for lefties and for righties, and then even a little bit better for righties. So why don't we all use Dvorak? And I think in your operating system you can go in and say, hey, I've got a Dvorak keyboard. The reason we haven't switched to it is because they've estimated that the cost of switching would outweigh the added benefits once we all relearn Dvorak. So imagine we just all switch today. We switch to Dvorak. Well, we've got a physical problem. We've got all these keyboards that we'd have to replace. Cell phone wouldn't be as big of an issue because you could do that electronically and update to your operating system. The challenge is then everyone has to relearn typing with Dvorak. And if we switch to Dvorak, we're going to be slower at first because we're used to QWERTY. And eventually, we will get to the point where we're equivalent. And then eventually we would be better at Dvorak because it's a more efficient layout. And the idea is the cost to do that, all the deficits for how long it takes to retrain everyone outweighs the cost, the added benefit when we do switch. If this ever does happen, I think what we're going to have to do is decide, okay, in let's say 2030, every new person born will start on Dvorak. And then eventually QWERTY will die out with us. But we'll see if that's ever happened. It kind of reminds me of the imperial metric system, and those are obviously still both around. Another example, traffic. It brings up safety concerns. We drive these large vehicles, relatively quickly. And roads sometimes are very well designed. Other times we have these very confusing stimulus response mappings like this sign. We've got, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 6 different stimuli, multiple overlapping ones. So if you want to turn left, all 3 of these lanes would seem to be appropriate. And that's complex. And that's not the best way to design a road system, because let's say you're driving down this road for the first time, you see this sign, it's kind of overwhelming. And you might not even have very long to make a decision based on typically how far signs are in advance of intersections. It's not like you can take 5 minutes, really think about it, and then approach the intersection. So when I taught up in Canada, I used to use this, stock photo, and I thought it was kind of silly, and who knows where in the world this, one sign exists. Surely they can't be that common. And then I moved to Lubbock, and all along the loop, there's this sign, which I guess is not as complex as that last example, but we still have 5 lanes. Traffic here is fairly fast, I think 50 miles per hour on the what I call an access road, but the road beside the loop. I think there's a better terminology in Texas, but I've lost it. And these turnaround lanes really threw me when I moved to Texas, because I haven't seen those anywhere else. And from what I've gathered from asking students is that they're mostly a Texas thing. So I like to call them the Texas turnaround lane. And they're great. They're really handy. If you miss your turn, or if it's just more strategic to go through and then loop back around, they're really great. But I remember the first time I saw these, I was like, okay, I want to turn left. Okay, so these lanes turn left. And I'm like, wait a second, U-turn lane? Like, what is this? So now I'm very used to this sort of signage, but it's probably not the most efficient stimulus response compatibility mapping because of the complexity to the number of choices that you could make here. And you don't have long until the intersection, and you might be traveling 50 miles per hour. So there's 3 more examples of compatibility in the real world, and I won't test you on these, but each one has a little video in case you'd like to watch them if you're interested. So there's a whole video dedicated to Norman doors, which are poorly designed doors. You've probably seen doors like this before, where you think it's a push or you think it's a pull, but it's actually the opposite. Those are called Norman doors. The 2000 presidential election, some argue that the winner came down to poor stimulus response compatibility. And you might think recent elections have been contentious, and that's true. The 2000 presidential election was actually decided by the Supreme Court. And I think about a month after the election day, which, man, if that happened nowadays, I guess we survived it then, but it seems so extreme. Thankfully, the elections, I think a day later, we've known the results. So 2000 was a special year. Roundabouts, love them or hate them. There's a few more popping around Lubbock each year. So if you'd like to learn about roundabouts, and this video kind of addresses the question of, are they better, are they worse in terms of stimulus response compatibility. So there's those slides for those videos, and I'll put the links in the description. So looking at these real world examples of compatibilities, is the realm of science here is called human factors. Human factors engineering, human factors psychology, kind of one or the other. And we have a department, I guess within psychology here at Texas Tech, there's a subgroup, human factors psychology, and they focus on researching these more kind of applied issues. It's also a huge area with industry as well. So car manufacturers are obviously very interested in how to design things efficiently for safety reasons, but also the more appealing an interface within a car, the more likely you might buy it, or the better it's designed, the more high-end it is, and the more you can charge for it. Apple is famous for having human factors researchers, and that's one reason their products just feel so intuitive to use. Also, the military, another huge application where safety is a huge concern. I actually did a semester with a military contractor as a human factors personnel. And there we often, the way we would think is like, okay, we're designing this product, and sure, when things are good and everyone's well rested, you'd probably use it 99.9% of the time correctly. But now imagine those extreme cases. So think of a soldier who's fatigued. Maybe they've been up for 24 hours guarding a base and they're under attack. So it's a very stressful situation. How can the products be designed even in those situations to make sure that they're designed as efficiently as possible, that the stimulus to response mapping is so intuitive and simple that even when you're fatigued and stressed, you can do so properly. What we're going to do though is we're going to transition to how do we look at stimulus response compatibility in cognitive psychology. So first off, a definition of stimulus response compatibility. A few different options here. We've got the degree of natural or learned correspondence between a stimulus and response. And some things are natural. We're soon going to see an example where if there's a left stimulus, you make a left response. And if there's a right stimulus, you make a right response. And that's something we're probably born with. Not sure if it kind of evolved that way at some point, but it's just kind of natural. Other things are learned. So step height. I don't think we're really born with an expectation of step height. Maybe in a few more millions of years if humans continually interact with steps. But we learn a step height from our environment. Another great example of learned compatibility are light switches. So in North America, it's very common that the switch being up means on and down means off. That's not the case everywhere. In Germany, up means off and down means on. So you can have different learned stimulus response compatibilities, which could be appropriate in one country and confusing or complex in another. Another definition, degree to which the relationship between a stimulus and response is consistent with expectations. And the last one, maybe my favorite because it's the shortest, degree of naturalness between a stimulus and a response. So what happens when the stimulus and response are compatible? Well, reaction time is shorter. This one's in bold because we'll see many examples of this. Errors are decreased, and that can be very important for safety. Learning is quicker, which is great, and user satisfaction is higher. You're going to prefer something that's compatible, and often this can be used by companies to make their product more desirable. So let's look at some of the origins of spatial compatibility. And this mostly goes back to some work by Professor Paul Fitts, who we'll see also later in the course. We have Fitts' law, a famous speed-accuracy trade-off named posthumously in his honor to Paul Fitts, its originator. Now, Paul Fitts served in World War II, and let me bring up my notes here. So he served in World War II. He was in the U.S. Air Force. And he became a founder in this new field post-World War II of human factors or engineering psychology, also sometimes called cognitive ergonomics. And Professor Fitts mostly focused on aviation psychology, and he worked on the idea of the interface between humans and machines. And this is an example of, I think, inside an airplane. And I think they have, I think this is a bombing crew. Hopefully I have that right. And these are very complex layouts. And during World War II, the way these were manufactured is the engineer said, okay, we got to make this bomber. It needs all these things that we're going to have multiple people working on. It's very complex. How can we build this as simply as possible? So, they make that part the most efficient. And then these people would come in and be like, whoa, this is really complicated. I wouldn't put this here, I wouldn't put that there. This is going to take a long time for me to learn. It has a poor stimulus response compatibility. And the problem with that is that it can lead to mistakes, which in a military situation can be very costly. So after World War II, Paul Fitts ushered in this era of human factors where they said, okay, well, let's not build it to be as easy as possible. Let's build it to make as most sense as possible for the human operator. We want to optimize stimulus response compatibility. Yes, maybe this airplane is going to take a little longer to build. Maybe it's going to cost a little more. Sure, it made sense having all the dials here. The wires are all right there. But if we put these ones here for the radio and these ones here for the engine, that's going to be easier for the personnel. So it kind of changed how we design products. And I think this experiment kind of shows that nowadays we almost take this for granted, the idea of understanding that the human is imperative in these stimulus-response mappings. So I think these results will seem straightforward, but Professor Fitz, had to do these controlled experiments to really demonstrate these fundamental principles of stimulus-response compatibility. So in this experiment, the participant has stimuli in front of them here and this response apparatus. And the stimuli could be of one of three patterns, so it could be like a circle of lights shown here, or this kind of diamond of lights, or these four lights, these kind of two horizontal and two vertical lights. They also had these responses, and there was kind of a circular response, this diamond or square response, and then these two responses, horizontal and vertical. So you would do 9 conditions. So here's one of the conditions where this happens to be the round stimuli and the round response. And you would hold this stylus, this instrumented pencil, if you will, and a light would turn on, and you needed to make the appropriate response as quickly and accurately as possible. So in this condition, if the top light came on, you'd be resting in the home position. You would have to move to the top. And if the left light turned on, you would have to move to the left. And what they did is they measured reaction time. How long did it take you to do that? And what was the percentage of errors? How many percentage of trials did you go to the wrong target? So in this first situation, with the circular lights, the circular responses, average reaction time was 390 milliseconds, and participants made about 5% mistakes. And they were trying to do this as kind of as quick as possible, not take your time, think about it, and then respond. And that's why there are some mistakes. You think, well, this is really simple, but you're also trying to be really fast. So let's stick with the same circular stimuli. Now they have a square response pattern. So here, if the this top left corner turned on, you would have to move either up and over or over and up. It was up to the participant. And here we can see the responses are longer and there's more errors. So stimulus response compatibility has decreased compared to this condition. Now what if we have the round stimuli, and this is actually a bimanual situation where one hand can go left to right and one can go up and down, which is demonstrated here. And if the light turned on the top left, then your left hand had to go left and your right hand had to go up to indicate that response. And you can see this is even less compatible because reaction time and the percentage of errors have increased. So out of these 3 response options, the most compatible with the circular stimuli are the circular responses. But that doesn't mean the circular responses are always best. It's going to depend on the type of stimuli. So let's go down to this kind of weird stimulus condition where they could be horizontal and vertical. Well, if we have, kind of horizontal and vertical stimuli, which are kind of strange, well, the most efficient, the most compatible response would be an equally strange or comparable response patterns. So, these match, right? These stimuli, these horizontal and vertical stimuli match nicely with these horizontal and vertical responses. So now we see that they're the most compatible mapping. And so what this research shows is that, well, whatever the stimulus look like, we should match the response with those. Or alternatively, whatever the responses look like, we should match the stimuli with those. So let's dig deeper into compatibility and what we can learn from cognitive psychology. So why should we study stimulus response compatibility, outside of human factors, where it seems very obvious, well, it's a great way to make products efficient, desirable, and safe. But why in cognitive psychology? Well, compatibility effects are these pervasive effects evidence in performance of simple laboratory tasks like what we just saw with Professor Fitz, everyday perceptual motor interactions, so think your keyboard, and complex human-machine interactions. And this could be, it doesn't have to be flying an airplane, but even driving a car is a relatively complex interface. The reason we're interested in them in cognitive psychology is because they provide a measure of and theoretical insight into basic cognitive processing that occurs during response selection. They're a window into response selection. Just like changing the number of stimulus response alternatives, we learn something about response selection. We can also change the compatibility of situations, or we can compare two situations. Well, it's sometimes not obvious. Is this more compatible or that? Well, we can run an experiment, look at reaction times and errors, for example, or rate of learning or user satisfaction to figure out which is more compatible. And then we can delve into, well, what does that tell us about the mind, about how we process information during response selection? And that's what we're going to spend the rest of this module looking at. So first, prototypical compatibility experiment. So this is two-choice reaction time, which we've seen before. It's a fairly easy task, but we're going to look at two versions of it. Now the first version we call the ipsilateral mapping, and this is the one we've already seen, where we tell the participant if you get a left stimulus, make a left response, and if you get a right stimulus, make a right response. Easy. Now slightly more complex. Oh, sorry. Before I move on, let's try this together. I know we've tried it before, but let's do it again. So it's the ipsilateral mapping, and stimuli will appear on the left or the right. And if it's on the left, make a left response. Right, make a right response. Okay. Here we go. Move this out of the way. Okay. Good job. So try to remember how long your reaction time felt there and see if it feels shorter, the same, or longer in this new condition. This is the contralateral mapping. So now if there's a stimulus on the left, you should make a right response. If there's a stimulus on the right, you should make a left response. Okay, let's give that a go. Okay, so did one feel longer than the other? If I brought you into the lab, if we controlled this, I can almost guarantee that everyone would be slower with the contralateral mapping. It's harder. And you should be quicker with the ipsilateral mapping, or we can think of that as the more compatible mapping. You may or may not have felt that at home. It's a large difference, usually 100 millisecond difference between these, which is typically large enough to feel, but when I've done this in the classroom, usually most students say that yes, the contralateral mapping feels longer. So reaction time is longer, but more specifically, it's because the duration of response selection increases with that incompatible or contralateral mapping. So for the rest of this module, know that when we're talking about changes in reaction time, more specifically, we mean response selection. So stimulus identification should be the same, whether it's on the left or the right. Our brain probably doesn't care too much unless maybe one eye is different than the other, but typically you should be able to see something on the left as quickly as you see something on the right. Now response programming, that should be comparable as well. Pressing the left finger, right finger, not very complex. Should both be quick and straightforward. Maybe a tiny advantage for your dominant hand, but that's more likely in something that requires more dexterity. And pressing a button is pretty straightforward. We also have pretty good experience pressing buttons with both fingers from typing. So when we see a difference in response selection with something that's less compatible or incompatible, like the contralateral mapping, it's because response selection has increased. Oops. So if you'd like, you can tackle the first set of practice questions now, just asking a few basic questions about this ipsilateral and contralateral mappings. So let's imagine a compatibility experiment. Just jump back here for a second. So let's say we're testing participants. They come in, and let's say we test 20 people. And half of them do the ipsilateral mapping first. So they do a bunch of trials, and then they do the contralateral mapping. The other half of the participants would have the opposite order. And we often call that a counterbalance, where they would do the contralateral mapping first and the ipsilateral mapping second. And that's to control for any practice effects. Like maybe if you do this mapping first, you get good at the task and that helps you be better at the second block. So we don't want everyone to do that because it could lead to an effect that's not caused by our manipulation, but something like practice, or the opposite could be fatigue. Maybe you get to the second block and you're so bored of this experiment that you're slower. So we're going to counterbalance those conditions. Here's data from one participant, and this is a kind of super simple experiment. The idea is they did 14 trials, and we would randomize. So this is the ipsilateral block, and it's just randomized whether the trial is left or right. We don't want to do 7 trials left and then 7 trials right, because the participant will probably realize, so we need to randomize those. And on every trial, we record their reaction time. Now, I did 14 trials just because it fits on the screen here. In the real world, when I do a reaction time experiment, I often like to have 100 trials in every condition so that I can do some fancy analysis on your reaction time. But we'll just stick with these simplified data. So the first thing the experimenter needs to do after this participant, we'd have to do this for all 20 participants, is organize the data. We don't want to average them all together. We want to know what is your average reaction time for your left hand and for your right hand. And more specifically in this ipsilateral condition, we've got left stimulus, left response. We had 7 of those trials. Right stimulus, right response, another 7 of those trials. And we can calculate our mean reaction time. We could go further with, say, standard deviation, but we'll keep this simple. Then they would do a second block, either before or after, depending on their counterbalance order. Another 14 trials. Now it's left stimulus, right response, and right stimulus, left response. We're going to organize those trials and calculate their means. So we've got these 4 mean values, and we're going to see lots of data or lots of examples with these data. But I just wanted to let you know that, well, there's a kind of a whole experiment behind these with many and many trials. What we're going to do is we're going to organize our data into this 2x2 table. And this is kind of the convention for compatibility experiments. So we have response position here, left response, right response, stimulus position, left stimulus, right stimulus, and we're going to put in all 4 of our data points. The only thing that's a little weird about this table is that the 2 compatible conditions are kind of on a diagonal, and the incompatible conditions are on the opposite diagonal. So if we look at where these data come from, we got to just be careful about how we plug them into our table to match our experimental conditions. So we're going to see a lot more of these tables. We won't worry about individual trials from now on. All right, so let's say we're going to plot the data from this one participant. And typically you would have multiple participants, maybe 20. Kind of depends on the size of the effect you're expecting to see. You can imagine a 2x2 for all 20 participants, and then we would average those together. So often what we're plotting are not the participant means, but the grand means across participants. To keep it simple, let's just run with these data from one participant. So the way we plot compatibility effects is we set up a plot like this. So we put response position on the x-axis. On the y-axis, we put the variable that we measure. And this is known as our dependent variable. The way I like to remember this is, well, what are the results of the experiment? Well, it depends on the participant. We don't know this in advance. It depends on the participant. So that's our dependent variable. So reaction time on the y-axis. We're also going to need a legend. So here it's stimulus position, and we'll have left stimulus, right stimulus. And to distinguish those, I'll have different colors and different shapes. One thing you don't want to do is mix up your x-axis and your legend. Because technically you could plot them the other way, but that's not the standard way to look at stimulus response compatibility data. So we're always going to have response position on our x-axis. All right, we now have these 4 data points we need to plot, and maybe let's start with this one. So we have a left response of 310, so we know it's got to go over here, up at 310, maybe about there. And it's a left stimulus, so it's going to be a blue triangle. So I need a blue triangle at about 310. So there we go. Oh, sorry. All right, next data point. Let's see which one I've animated. Okay, we've got a left response, so it's still over here. It's a right stimulus, so we're going to need a red square, and it's got to be at 377, so right about here. Perfect. Okay, 2 more data points. We've got a right response, so now we're over on this side of the graph. Left stimulus means it's a blue, what did I press? Blue triangle, and it's at 386, which is right there. And last one, right response, so again over here on the right of the graph, right stimulus, so a red square, and that's got to go at 307, right about here. The last thing we do is we connect the like stimuli together. So the two red squares get connected with the line, and the two blue triangles get connected with the line. And there we go. We've got our stimulus response compatibility graph. Now note that what we typically see here is an X. And with a little more experience looking at these, it might be very obvious to you why it's an X, but it might help, especially when with your first compatibility graph, if we draw some pictures here to demonstrate what we're looking at in each condition. So in here we see these short reaction times. Well, if we look at what are these trials, these are the ipsilateral trials. Left stimulus, left response. We can see that immediately in the picture, but we can also distinguish that from the legend and the location on the graph. Here we're slower, and it makes sense that we're slower for these contralateral mappings. The kind of incompatible condition has a longer reaction time. So this is our typical compatibility graph, and we're going to kind of dig deeper into these findings. If you'd like to practice graphing, in the practice questions, there's 3 or 4 examples of graphs that you can make to get really good at doing these. When we look at our graphs, we want to answer the question of, is there a compatibility effect? Now, what does that mean? So a compatibility effect, well, I'll start by reading this. The compatibility effect is when the ipsilateral / compatible condition has a shorter reaction time than the contralateral / incompatible condition. In other words, there's a compatibility effect when the results make sense, when they match what we predict. So you should be faster at ipsilateral than contralateral. And if the results show that, we say that yes, there's a compatibility effect. Now note that we check this twice. We're going to look for a compatibility first with a left response and then with a right response. And let me demonstrate that on a graph. So here's the data we just looked at. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the left response first. We're going to say, is there a compatibility effect for the left response? So we don't even need the right responses. They're irrelevant to this question, so I'll blank them out. So do these results make sense is maybe an easier question than is there a compatibility effect. So yes, these results make sense because compatible is faster than incompatible. We're not going to worry about running stats on these. We just want to see visually, is this one lower than this one? Here it's a big difference, but it could be a small visible difference. Just as long as there is a visible difference, we'll say yes, there's a compatibility effect. So you see, yes, there is a compatibility effect for the left response. What about with the right response? So we only need the two data points on the left here, so let's blank out the ones on the right so they don't distract us. And okay, this condition is faster, it's the compatible condition, so these results make sense. So yes, there is a compatibility effect for the right response. And that's what we expect. Those are the results that make sense. Let's look at a few other graphs. So here, before we had an X, now we kind of have a smaller X. But are there compatibility effects? Well, let's look at the left. Okay, that is the compatible condition. It is faster, so yes, we have a compatibility effect for the left response. What about on the right? Yeah, so it's smaller than before, but it's faster, so we're going to say that yes, there's a compatibility effect for the right. So we went from an X to a smaller X. What about something a little different? Ooh, what about a tilted X? So let's look at the left. So on the left, yep, the ipsilateral condition is faster than contralateral. So yes, we have a compatibility effect for the left response. Now what about over here on the right? Yep, the ipsilateral condition is faster than contralateral. So we'll say yes, there is a compatibility effect for the right response. Oops, let's go back. Now when would we see something like this? This is a bit of an extreme example. So you're typically not this much faster with your right hand if it's your dominant hand than your left. But maybe you could see this in someone who had had a stroke and their left arm was more affected by the stroke. That's their paretic or weak arm. And as long as they're at a point where they could, respond with both hands, maybe not the day of the stroke, but after some rehab, you might see that they're much faster with their strong arm than their paretic arm. All right, now we've left X's behind. We don't have an X at all. So do we have compatibility effects? Well, let's look at the left first. So let's see. Well, it's a small difference, but yeah, there's still a visible difference. I almost got mixed up here. Incompatible is now faster than compatible. That does not make sense, right? That doesn't match our prediction. So we're going to say there is not a compatibility effect for the left response. What about over here on the right? Okay, huge difference. And compatible is faster than incompatible. So yep, that is a compatibility effect. So in the previous examples, we had seen cases where we had a compatibility effect on the left and the right, but that's not necessarily always the case. You can have a compatibility effect on one side and not on the other. I think this is the last example. We're back to this really nice looking X, and it's tempting when we see these X's to say, oh yeah, two compatibility effects, but this X is actually an inverted X, and we don't have compatibility effects. So take a look at here. Incompatible is faster, doesn't make sense. So there's not a compatibility for the left response. And the same on the right. This doesn't make sense that incompatible is faster than compatible. So there's also not a compatibility effect for the right response. So just because you see an X, make sure it could be two compatibility effects, or it could be two not compatibility effects. So if you like some practice looking at graphs and determining whether there are compatibility effects, check out the practice questions. You'll use the graphs that you just made and then address whether or not they have compatibility effects on the left and right. This is an example that I would do in class when I teach the in-class version of this. And it's another example if you want to practice where you've got some data, so you'll need to graph your data, and then once it's graphed, you can determine whether there are compatibility effects. And the one reason I left it in here, just in case it helped me kind of walking through the results in more detail than you get in the sample questions where it's just either no answer or completed answer. So if we're going to graph these points, we got to set up our graph. Our y-axis is our dependent variable, which is reaction time. Our y-axis is left response, right response. Remember, we don't want to do stimulus on the x-axis. We want that as a legend. Now we have 4 points to plot. Hopefully I've done this correctly, and they go about here. The values were fairly straightforward so that they'd fall into these equal intervals and not be kind of between and hard to put in the exact spot. We connect our like stimuli together with lines, and then finally we get to the question of, are there compatibility effects? And here it's probably a little harder at first glance because I haven't added labels. But if we look here, this is a left response to a right stimulus. That's the contralateral mapping. It should not be faster, so we conclude there is not a compatibility effect. Over here, the faster condition is the right stimulus, right response. Well, that's ipsilateral. That's supposed to be faster. So yes, there is a compatibility effect for the right response. So a little summary here. So stimulus and response sets are coded or represented in terms of their spatial locations. When the stimulus and response codes match, so when you have to associate a left stimulus with a left response, responses are shorter and more accurate than when they don't match. Stimulus-response compatibility effects are attributed to more efficient stimulus-response translation during response selection. And so far, I think it just kind of makes sense that, yeah, your brain saying left goes with left, right goes with right would be easier. But we're going to delve into a more detailed interpretation or explanation of that. And that is with the dual process model. Besides just saying, yeah, left goes with left and right goes with right, which is a okay answer, but to a scientist, we want to know, well, how, why, what are the cognitive mechanisms, or how are we processing information that makes left go with left and left not go with right? And we're going to see that with the dual process model. Now, I like a couple things about this model. First, it's based on information processing, and we've seen that a few times already. And second, it can explain many examples of compatibility. And we'll see at least 3, maybe 4 in the rest of this module. So it's not ultra specific, it doesn't just explain one thing, it explains lots of compatibility situations and even some tasks that we might not initially think of as being an issue with compatibility. Let's look at this model. Now, first of all, I'm not going to test you on reproducing this model. There's a lot of boxes, but I think intuitively it's not as complex as it looks. And the way you'll be evaluated on this is on understanding the dual process, the 2 pathways in this model, and how those pathways interact. And that's going to make a lot more sense with an example. So let's pretend we're doing ipsilateral mapping in 2-choice reaction time. And on this trial, it happens to be a left stimulus that requires a left response. So what happens during information processing within this dual process model? Well, the way the model works is it says there's some initial stimulus identification, and then very quickly it branches into dual processing. So parallel processing, if you will. So that information of the stimuli is sent to 2 different areas of the brain, and it's going to process the situation independently. One process we call the automatic process, the other we call the intentional process, and that will make more sense in a moment. Now, the automatic process, based on its name, it's going to do the most automatic, reflexive, obvious thing to do in this situation. So it says, it knows that there's a stimulus on the left. It says, great, something on the left. Obvious thing to do is to select a left response. So it's going to select a left response. Because it made that decision so quickly, it's going to say, well, you know what, I'm also going to program that response. So it does response programming and prepares a left response. And then it's going to check what the other pathway decided. So our intentional pathway, instead of just doing the most obvious thing, it's going to think about the situation and the instructions given to the participant. So it says there's something on the left. We know that from this early stimulus identification. Well, what am I supposed to do? What are the instructions? Well, it's ipsilateral, so when there's something on the left, I should make a left response. So I'll select a left response. These 2 pathways come together, and somewhat by chance in this situation, they both want to do the same thing. They're like, yeah, I want to do left, you want to do left. Great, we agree. So we should go ahead and make a left response. And the good news is the automatic process has already programmed a left response. So it's in our motor areas ready to go. And we can just go ahead and initiate that response. Now, all of these steps take time. And here we have relatively few steps. We'll see the next example will take more steps. So we're going to say that this is a short reaction time. All right, let's go through contralateral. And things are going to play out a little different. We're now going to see that the 2 pathways want to do different things, and they need to resolve that conflict. All right, so we have a stimulus on the left. So we have some stimulus identification here. It identifies that, yes, there's a stimulus on the left. Automatic process, just like before, says, well, the most obvious thing if there's a left stimulus is to select a left response, and I'm going to program that left response. The intentional process says, okay, we know there's something on the left. What are the instructions? Well, it's contralateral. So if there's something on the left, I need to make a right response. So I'm going to select a right response. These pathways meet up and they say, hey, what do you want to do? Well, automatic wants to do left, intentional wants to do right. Oh, that's a conflict. Now, when there's a conflict, we are going to trust the pathway that thought more deeply about the instructions. We're going to trust the intentional process. So imagine you, if you have two roommates, and one studies math and one studies fine arts. And if you come to them with a math question and they disagree, well, you're going to trust your math friend, right? And if you have a fine arts question and they disagree, you're going to trust your fine arts friend. So here, we're going to trust the intentional process because we know it's thinking more deeply about the instructions in this task. So because they don't agree, the problem is that the automatic process already programmed that left response, and we don't want to do that. So we need to abort that response. We got to cancel it. We got to kind of get rid of it, clean our motor areas, so we can now program the right response, the response selected by the intentional process, and then we can then initiate that response. So compared to the previous example, the ipsilateral mapping, we have 2 extra stages, so we're going to have a longer reaction time. So it's kind of a lot of boxes to this dual process model, but the way we need to, or the way you'll be tested on it, is just in the following. So I could give you a situation and ask, okay, well, what is the automatic response here? And because there's something on the right, the automatic response is right. What is the intentional response? Well, it's an ipsilateral mapping, so it's also right. And because those match, there should be a short reaction time. So you really just need to know kind of these 2 things. What does the automatic process want to do? What does the intentional process want to do? And how does that affect your reaction time? Contralateral example over here. So the automatic response would be right. Intentional response would be left because it's contralateral. Because those conflict, we're going to have a longer reaction time. Now I said before that Stroop can explain things that might not even look like a compatibility situation at first. And a famous example of that is the Stroop task. You've probably seen this before, maybe in Intro to Psychology. You just may not have heard it called by that name. But let's take a look, and I think this will be familiar to you. And we're going to see how it can be explained with the dual process model. So in the Stroop task, you need to name the ink color of words. Now there's an easy condition and a hard condition. So the easy condition, we can think of this as compatible. Here, the name of the word and the ink color are the same. So this word, the letters say black. And if we say, okay, well, what's the color of the ink? It's also black. So this is actually easy because they match. So let's try this task together. So on screen, I think we're going to have 16 colors. And I want you to say the ink color. But this will be easy because the ink color and the letters of the word have the same meaning. Okay, here we go. I'll try it aloud as well. Blue, red, yellow, green, black, yellow, blue, red, green, black, red, blue, yellow, black, blue, green. It's easy, right? Short reaction times. Now here's the incompatible condition, or the hard condition. Here there's going to be a mismatch between what the word says. So those letters spell out green. But remember, we need to say the color of the ink, which in this case is red. So let's try this again. And you should very quickly see and feel that this is a lot harder. Whew, okay, here I go. Green, blue, black, yellow, blue, red, black, green, red, blue, yellow, black, green, yellow, red, blue. Whew, okay. So very obviously much easier in this condition than this condition. So how do we interpret this with the dual process model? Well, with the dual process model, the automatic thing that you want to do is read the word. And it's kind of interesting that that's the automatic response, because we're not born knowing how to read, but we practice it so much that the brain is almost excited when it can read something. It's like, oh, I know how to read. So when we see this, the automatic thing, the automatic pathway says, I want to say blue. The intentional part is saying the color of the ink. And maybe it makes sense that that's intentional, because that's not typically what we do when we look at words. Like the default thing to do when we see a word is to read it, not to think about what color is that word. But here, because those two things match, this is the compatible easy condition, you're going to have a short reaction time. Now this trial, for example, so automatically I want to read it, I want to say blue, but what I'm supposed to do is name the ink color, which is green. Now these don't match, so that's going to increase your reaction time, and that could also lead to errors, which may have happened. I might have even made some mistakes when I tried to read those ink colors. So there's a few sample questions on the dual process model. If you'd like to take a look at those before we compare the dual process model to another model. So what explains the spatial compatibility effect? And by the spatial compatibility effect, I simply mean that the contralateral condition is longer, has a longer reaction time than the ipsilateral condition. And we're going with, our first hypothesis is that we can nicely explain it with the dual process model. That when the automatic and intentional processes conflict, we have longer reaction time, and that occurs in the contralateral condition. There is, however, an alternate hypothesis, and that's that explanation we call neuroanatomical correspondence. And it states that spatial compatibility effects are caused by the anatomical congruence between the cerebral hemispheres processing the stimuli and response. It's basically saying it's not about this intentional and automatic processes, it's just about how we're mapped and how information comes in and how it then goes out to make a motor response with our hands. So to understand that, let's look at the neuroanatomy of the visual input and the motor output. So we're going to look at this at a fairly basic level here. This is probably something you already know, but later on in the course, especially when we talk about vision, we're going to learn a lot more about the visual input and motor output as well. So if I'm going to make a response with my left hand, that motor command mostly originates from the opposite or contralateral motor cortex. So if I need to make a right response, that motor command is actually going to come from my left hemisphere. So there's this contralateral output. The left hemisphere controls the right hand, and I'm sure you've heard that before. How does this happen? Well, the left hemisphere, we can think of our cortical spinal pathway, could be where the motor command descends. And from the motor areas of the brain, it's going to descend through the brainstem. And when it gets to the lower levels of the brainstem, it crosses over, this single axon here, crosses from the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere. And we call that a decussation. That's, I guess, the fancy Latin word. And then it will continue to descend until it gets to the right level of the spinal cord to send those motor commands out to the hand. And that could be lower cervical, upper thoracic, kind of depending on the muscles of the arm. So that's why a motor command from the right hand originates from the left hemisphere and vice versa. Now what about the stimulus? So that's the output, but we need the input as well. So imagine a trial where we're looking at the middle of the screen, so I'm showing the fixation here, and the stimulus appears on the right. And things are nicely color-coded here, so you can see this blue or cyan. It shows the right side of the world kind of hitting both retina, and that information travels down the visual system and will eventually make its way to the left primary visual cortex. Once we get to vision, we'll actually learn about this entire pathway, but all we need to know at this point is when we see something on the right, that information goes to the opposite hemisphere, to the left hemisphere, to the primary visual cortex. And also vice versa, when we see something on the left, that information would end up in the right primary visual cortex. So we've got this crossing of input, and we also have a crossing of the output. We see these crossings over and over in the nervous system. We don't know exactly why, but it seems to be a fundamental building block of how the nervous system is organized. Our brain, our mind, seems to like crossing input and output. Let's apply this to our two mappings, ipsilateral and contralateral. So in this case, I'm trying to depict a condition where we have a right stimulus and it's the ipsilateral mapping, so we need to make a right response. So how is that information going to travel? So we have a right stimulus. That's going to go to our left primary visual cortex. We can think of that as step one. From there, it needs to go to the motor areas of the brain. So that's step two. Now we're in the left hemisphere, and coincidentally, the left hemisphere controls the right hand, and we want to make a right response. So step three, we can go ahead and send that motor command out to the right hand and make a response. So this is 3 steps, and the fewer the steps, the quicker, the shorter the reaction time. So these are, axons, this is neurotransmitters, saltatory conduction, action potentials, all very fast, but it does take time. 3 steps will take longer than 4 steps, or 5, or 6, or more. What about contralateral? So we're going to stick with a right stimulus, but now it's contralateral, so you need to make a left response. So a stimulus on the right ends up in the left primary visual cortex, step 1. It goes to the motor areas in the left hemisphere. The problem is we want to make a response with the left hand, and we can't do that from the left hemisphere. So we need an extra step, which I've kind of put in bold here to emphasize it's an extra step for that information to cross, most likely, the corpus callosum to the other hemisphere. We'll see the corpus callosum later in the course. And then, now that we're in the right hemisphere, we can send that information out, or send that motor command down to the left hand. So we've got 4 steps. We've added a step, so we should expect a longer reaction time. So if we think about neuroanatomical correspondence, it predicts that we should be faster when in ipsilateral conditions, there's only 3 steps, and slower in contralateral conditions. And if you'd like to look at the practice questions, there's just a couple to reinforce the crossing of our neuroanatomy, both the input and output. Okay, back to our 2 hypotheses. So neuroanatomical predicts ipsilateral is fast, contralateral is slow. Now the dual process model, if you remember its predictions, it also predicts that ipsilateral is fast and contralateral is slow. So they're predicting the same thing. And the results, of course, do show that ipsilateral is fast as contralateral is slow. So because these results support both hypotheses, we can't say that one is correct and one is incorrect. They both seem correct. And what we would really like to do, hypothetically, is design an experiment where they make opposite predictions. So it's a little hard to see here, but if you can see the red line is a forward slash here, and it's a backward slash here. So these are opposite predictions. Then we could run an experiment, and this is all hypothetical, and we would see which results match. So in this case, the red lines are the same here and here. So we would say, oh, neuroanatomical is correct and dual process is wrong. But we currently can't do that because they both predict the same thing. So enter kind of the genius of cognitive psychology. How can we design an experiment so that these 2 hypotheses make opposite predictions? And the answer to that, which seems so simple that it might be irrelevant, but turns out it's of critical importance, is we ask participants to cross their hands. So you're going to cross your hands, and you'll do 1 block with an ipsilateral mapping. So left stimulus still requires a left response, although that is now with your right hand. And then you would do a contralateral mapping. So here, a left stimulus requires a right response, which now happens to be with your left hand. So how will this result in opposite predictions of our 2 hypotheses? Well, in terms of the dual process model, we don't have a super satisfying, deep explanation, but the dual process model simply says, well, we don't care whether the hands are crossed or not crossed. If a left stimulus goes with the left response, I don't care what the hands are doing, that should be fast. And if a left stimulus requires a right response, that should be slow. So we're just going to kind of leave it at that the dual process model says it doesn't matter the hands are crossed, ipsilateral should still be faster. For neuroanatomical, we can look at the neuroanatomy. So this is the ipsilateral condition, but the hands are now crossed. So we have a right stimulus. So 1 step is needed to get that to the left primary visual cortex. We can then go up to the motor areas in the left hemisphere, but we can't send that out because that would move the right hand, and we want to make a response with the left hand, because the left hand will make a right response because our hands are crossed. So we've got to throw in that extra step before we can send out the output. So when our hands are crossed, we're actually, neuroanatomical predicts that we're going to be slower. In the contralateral condition, neuroanatomical now predicts you'll be faster, and we can map that out. So if a right stimulus goes to the left primary visual cortex, goes up to the motor areas in the left hemisphere. And because we want to make a left response with our right hand, we can go ahead and send that motor command out to our right hand to make a left response. And that only took 3 steps, so we should be faster. So if we look at our predictions, we're in this perfect case now. All we had to do is ask people to cross their hands, and our 2 hypotheses are making opposite predictions. And let me show you what those would look like in terms of our graphs. So here they are. Their opposite predictions might be hard to see at first, but we have a backslash here and a forward slash here in red. And I couldn't fit on all the little pictures, but if we look ipsilateral, in the dual process model, what does it predict will be slower? It says contralateral will be slower. What about neuroanatomical correspondence? What does it predict will be slower? It says ipsilateral will be slower. So that's opposites. So what are the actual results? Here are the actual results. Now take a minute to think, do these results support the dual process model or neuroanatomical correspondence? So here, let's plot. These might make it a little easier. So if we see, okay, well, what are we fast at when the hands are crossed? When the hands are crossed, the easier, faster condition is ipsilateral. And remember that those results support the dual process model. So from just asking people to cross their hands, we now know that the correct interpretation of these results, the correct explanation, is the dual process model, and neuroanatomical cannot explain these results. And you might be thinking, well, hold on, how is that the case? Isn't that our neuroanatomy? And yes, I did not lie to you. That is how we are mapped. The input crosses and the output crosses. But what we've found is that the time to cross, so for that extra step to go across the corpus callosum, is very, very short. Maybe it's like 2 to 4 milliseconds. And when we look at these compatibility effects, so if we take our slow contralateral conditions, subtract our faster ipsilateral conditions, that's maybe 100 millisecond difference. 375, oh, that's actually even, nope, sorry, that is, 100 milliseconds. So the cost here is 100 milliseconds. The cost for that extra step is maybe 4 milliseconds. So that can explain this huge cost that's in the opposite direction as predicted. Maybe I can convince you of that another way. So when we look at this compatibility effect, when we subtract slow contralateral from fast ipsilateral, there's about 100 millisecond difference. So yes, there is a 4 millisecond cost to cross the corpus callosum, and that benefits the contralateral condition when the hands are crossed. So because it's in the opposite direction, I'm going to plot it as a negative cost. Now the dual process cost, the cost for the conflict between automatic and intentional processes, well, that must be like 104 milliseconds, and positive because it's in this direction. We're slower for contralateral than ipsilateral. So what we're seeing are these 2 costs combined. We have this -4 cost, we have this positive 104 millisecond cost. In the end, that gives us this 100 millisecond cost, and which is the spatial compatibility effect. So yes, neuroanatomy is a thing, but it's a drop in a bucket of this dual process cost, and it's actually even in the wrong direction. So neuroanatomy, yes, does have a cost, but it can't explain this giant difference between ipsilateral and contralateral. That is mostly, I guess, 100 out of the, I'm trying to think about how to use numbers. I'll stay away from that analogy. It's mostly explained by the conflict between the the automatic and intentional processes. One more compatibility experiment to look at before we end with kind of a fun applied example. Now this is the Simon task and the Simon effect. So far in the classic compatibility, arms crossed or not crossed, what you've been responding on is based on the location of the stimulus. So if it's on the left, do this. If it's on the right, do that. The location of the stimulus is vital to what you're doing in this task. Now the Simon task, or the Simon effect, is interesting because the location of the stimulus is irrelevant. The stimulus, as shown up here, the circle, will appear on the left or the right, but it actually doesn't matter where it appears. The location of the stimulus is irrelevant. What you need to focus on is the color of the stimulus. Oh, and I just noticed I have a Canadian-British spelling of color that has somehow lasted in my slides for 9 years. Okay, I'll have to fix that. So, what I mean by that is what you're told as the participant. So you've got a blue button and a green button. And you're told, doesn't matter if the stimulus is on the left or the right. If it's a blue stimulus, press the blue button, and if it's a green stimulus, press the green button. So here, if you get a blue stimulus on the left, you press the blue button. If you get a blue stimulus on the right, doesn't matter that it's on the right. What's important is that it's blue, you press the left button. And you do the opposite if it's a green stimulus. And the question with the Simon task is, will the location of the stimulus still matter? Will your brain still think about whether it's on the left or the right? And if it does, you might be faster in these conditions. If your brain says, ooh, left goes with left, I like that, right? Then maybe you're faster in this condition, even though you're not supposed to focus or even need to think about the location. You're supposed to focus on just the color. But will our brain even code spatial location when it's irrelevant to the task? And if it does, you'll find these conditions fast, and these ones will be incompatible or slower, because now you've got, say, a right stimulus that needs to go with a left response, or a left stimulus that needs to go with a right response. So let's try this for ourselves. We'll have, I think, about 8 trials of this task. Some will have this, what we'll call a compatible mapping, and some will be incompatible, and try to think whether some responses feel longer than others. Why is it called the Simon task? This experiment was originated by Professor Simon, so it's named kind of in his honor. What sort of results might we predict? Well, it might not matter that the stimulus is on the left or the right, because again, it's irrelevant. All you should really be thinking about, all your brain needs to think about, is the color. So if it's irrelevant, reaction time should basically be the same in every condition. And I've drawn them apart here just so we can see that there are 4 data points. But every condition should be equally difficult. If your brain does code spatial location, then those compatible conditions, would be faster, and then these ones would be slower. So let's try this experiment and see if we can, feel the difference for ourselves, or not feel a difference. Perhaps I've said too much. Okay, so let's do the Simon task, and here it's going to be blue or red. So if it's blue, make your left response. If it's red, make a right response. The stimuli, I think they're circles, and they're going to appear up here on the left or the right. But remember, where they appear is irrelevant. What you need to think about is which color is it, and then is that a left or a right response? Okay, here we go. Okay, so did it feel like every trial had a comparable reaction time? Or did it seem easier when the left stimulus was required a left response and a right stimulus required a right response? So what are the actual results? And this is what we see in the real world when we test this in a controlled situation. Now the difference between, let's put up some pictures here. The difference between the compatible trials and the incompatible trials is smaller than the typical 2-choice reaction time task. So it's only about 50 milliseconds, so you may or may not have felt a difference. But if we brought you into the lab, gave you a couple hundred trials, looked at your averages, we should replicate that you'd be faster when it's compatible or when a left stimulus requires a left response than when it's incompatible. So what this shows us is that the brain can't help but code spatial location. ideally, you would turn off spatial location. You would tell your brain, location doesn't matter, focus on color. But it seems like we can't. Spatial location is so relevant to us in most of our situations that we're always kind of thinking when something appears, well, where is it? Is it the left or is it right? Where is it relative to me, to other things in the environment? We can't help but code spatial location. How can we interpret this with the dual process model? Well, let's think about this situation. We know this is compatible. So when we see a blue stimulus on the left, the most obvious reflexive thing to do, what our automatic process wants to do, is make a left response. The intentional process is going to think about color. Remember, it thinks about the instructions. The instructions are about color. It's blue. Blue means make a left response. So because those match, we should see a short reaction time. Over here, okay, we've got a green stimulus on the left. The automatic process says, oh, something on the left. I want to make a left response. Intentional says, well, wait a second, it's about color. If it's green, we need to make a right response. Because those conflict, we have to resolve the difference. There's a few extra steps. We're ultimately going to do what the intentional path wants, but we're going to see a longer reaction time. And that's why the dual process model is great, because it really works for many compatibility experiments and for even Stroop tasks, something that you might not think being a compatibility effect. All right, kind of a last fun example here. We'll go from kind of real world to cognitive psychology experiments that kind of tell us about the real world. And this is my introduction to it. So this is a series by an artist called Our Kind of People by Yete Ross Smith. Hopefully I got his name fairly close. And the idea is it's looking at stereotypes. So this description is probably the most accurate from his website, and the link's in the description. But what it does is it shows, real people wearing their, real clothing. And the idea is for you to look at that and kind of interpret, well, what sort of associations or stereotypes, jump to mind when you see these, the same individual in a very different outfit. So maybe let's play on some stereotypes here. And if I'm walking down a dark alley in Lubbock and I see this individual, I think, oh, accomplished businessman, perhaps out for a night out, right? But if I'm walking down that same dark alley and I see this individual, maybe I'm like, oh, I gotta be careful. Maybe he wants to steal my wallet. Obviously I'm being kind of completely ridiculous here. But that's what this artist is examining in this series. And I think it's quite powerful. There's more examples on the website. Do we have a scientific version of this? Yes. Sort of. Maybe not one-to-one, but let's look at it. So it's called the Implicit Association Test, or the IAT. And you may have heard about this again in say, like Introduction to Psychology. Now, what is it? It's an indirect measure for examining bias. And those two things are going to be very important. So indirect, we can't use this test and say, you are racist, for example, or you have bad stereotypes. It's measuring something indirect, and it's measuring these biases. And that's not as concrete as something like saying that you're racist or you're not, or you have this stereotype or you don't. So this test has been around for a long time. There's a great website with many different experiments. I've listed, I think, just some of them here. There's a lot you can do with just saying, hey, this is my country, and here's a few demographic information, demographic information, probably like age, things like that. But if you sign up and give it even more info, you can partake in actual experiments that are collecting data right now. And this, since I last looked, has expanded into kind of social attitudes, health, and even this youth category. And that one I didn't go into because I didn't want to make a fake profile saying that I was a youth. But there's probably even more topics under there. And we'll look at just one example of an implicit association test comparing your indirect measure of bias, we have to be careful about how we say this, for Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. So let's look at that specific example to get an idea of how these experiments work. So there are many control blocks in this experiment, but we're going to compare kind of the two vital blocks. And first of all, these are the type of stimuli. It's a reaction time experiment. You're going to get a stimulus, and you need to make a left response or a right response as quickly as possible. Now, what are the stimuli? So there are good words and bad words, and I don't think there's anything contentious about this. Good words are things like cherish, delight, joyous. Fine, right? Now, I don't think that's going to cause, an argument. There are bad words: ugly, annoy, hurtful. Yeah, sure, those are bad words. There's going to be pictures of Kamala Harris, and there's going to be pictures of Donald Trump. Sure, nothing too controversial yet. Here are the first of the two important blocks outside of controls. We won't worry about all 7 of them. But in this block, what you're told is, hey, when a word or a stimulus, an image, appears, if it's a bad word or a picture of Kamala Harris, make a left response. If it's a good word or a picture of Donald Trump, make a right response. Like, okay, fair enough. In the next block, they flip it around. So now, let's see, what did they flip? So it's still bad on the left, good word on the right. But now, if it's a picture of Donald Trump, make a left response, and it's a picture of Kamala Harris, make a right response. So let's run with an example. Let's pretend that an individual really likes Donald Trump and really dislikes Kamala Harris. In that case, this block with Trump and good both associated together with a right response is going to be easier for them to cognitively maintain, because it just makes sense. They're a Trump fan, so Trump, good, grouping those together, that should have short reaction time. Likewise, Harris, bad, yep, those in this individual's mind are mapped together, so that will also have, think of it as being compatible. We'll have a short reaction time. Then when they go to this block, well, because they like Trump, and I guess I was going to say we don't have to get political, but I guess, yes, we are probably talking about politics here, unless people, I don't think people have that, well, let's not worry about that. So let's pretend politically, they like Donald Trump. So now when they have to associate Trump and bad together, that kind of is against their indirect bias or their conceptualizations, their stereotypes. So they're going to be slower now. And again, because they don't like Kamala Harris, having to associate her and good together is kind of against how their mind is organized. So these are results for this similar experiment done in 2017. And in that time, it was actually Trump versus Barack Obama. So I don't think the results for the Harris-Trump one are available yet, but we can get an idea of what we're looking at from these. So let's say you have comparable reaction time in both of those blocks. Doesn't seem to make a difference to you. Well, we would say you have no automatic preference between Harris and Trump. Didn't make a difference. Down here, though, what you might find is that you're way faster associating Trump with good than Kamala with good. And that would put you in kind of this proportion. We say you've got this strong automatic preference. Oh, sorry, I've got this backwards. Strong automatic preference for other preference compared to Trump. So this would be you're much faster when it's Kamala good. Down here, this means you're much faster, or you have a strong automatic preference for that Trump good block. And some people, it unfortunately doesn't say the magnitude of the reaction time difference, but let's say this is 100 millisecond advantage, and then this might be 60, this might be 30, and this might be no difference, so 0. It's organized in terms of the results, but I don't know in this particular case how much of a reaction time difference that was. So instead of voting, could you just do this implicit association test? Well, first, that's a little silly, because a vote, you would just say, well, I picked this person or that person. The implicit association test, you'd have to do these 7 blocks of trials, which is maybe not the best. Well, think of how long the poll lines would be if we did that. So no, we don't obviously want to use this for voting. The other thing is that whatever we're assessing here, whether it's a stereotype or this automatic bias, it doesn't necessarily mean you would vote for him. There's a huge difference between like a reaction time task and a well thought out conscious decision. Like, who do I want to vote for? Maybe you spend, weeks thinking about these issues, looking up different political opinions, weighing different factors. Maybe Trump says something you do like, but Kamala on a different issue says something you do like, and you gotta go through a whole bunch of issues in the end to figure out what's more important for you. And when they've looked at the relationship between, say, these reaction time tasks and these well thought out decisions, they're only weakly associated with each other. So even if you do the IAT and it says, hey, you seem to love Trump, doesn't mean you would vote for him. Now, one of those reasons, or a few reasons, is because this implicit association test might be assessing something like familiarity or cultural stereotypes. And a couple examples of this, let's say you had a family member, maybe your uncle looks like Trump. So that kind of face is very familiar to you. Or maybe you have an aunt that looks like Harris. In that case, that would be more familiar to you. And that could affect your reaction times. Or there could be cultural stereotypes at play. Oh, and this is where my notes will become helpful. So maybe, like Kamala Harris, you have an Indian and Afro-Jamaican ancestry. Maybe that's the kind of community you grew up in. So seeing those sorts of faces are more familiar to you, which would affect your reaction time. And that doesn't necessarily mean you would vote for Kamala Harris. That just says something about the people you grew up around. For Trump, perhaps, like Trump, you share his German and Scottish ancestry, and you grew up around those sorts of people. So the implicit association test, it measures something, but remember, it's indirect, and it's this bias, and it's not necessarily predictive of well thought out decisions, like who you would vote for. If we think about racism, so imagine you apply for a job and they say, you got to do this test and we're going to see if you're racist, and if you are, we're not going to hire you. Obviously that would be very contentious. And sometimes there are experiments with the implicit association test, and the experimenters are typically very careful about how they discuss the results. Sometimes we see them picked up in the news, and if you imagine a headline like reaction time test determines whether you're racist, that's not exactly how this test works. So just remember, all data should be interpreted with scientific skepticism. And I think there was one last thing I wanted to say about the implicit association test. Let me check my notes here. So well thought out decisions, like who you vote for, who to hire, they can't really be predicted with this sort of test. I remember my last point. There are other uses of the implicit association test that are not controversial at all. There was a sport management research here in kinesiology and sport management in the past, and he used this test to look at your unconscious bias or your preferences for snacks at a sporting event. So you would still do the same sort of task, and maybe you do the task and it says, oh, you prefer hamburgers over hot dogs. That's not going to be picked up by the news and be like, oh, people are racist towards hamburgers. No, it's maybe you'd be surprised. You might have thought, oh, when I think about what I want, I do prefer a hot dog, but this test seems to suggest I prefer a hamburger, which is obviously not as contentious as, this Trump-Harris kind of good and bad. So that's kind of an extension in this world of compatibility, this implicit association test, which has sometimes, been picked up in the news and sometimes spun inaccurately. But it does come back to this kind of idea of compatibility. So thanks, everyone, and good luck with the test.